Welcome to Better Humanhood, where we build a better world by building better people. We have to live on the planet, and we have to live with other people. We have conversations about making that a wonderful proposition.
Welcome back to Better Humanhood. We are coming up on Independence Day here in the United States, so let me know if this sounds familiar. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation they derive right inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Sounds vaguely familiar, right? But not quite right? Yeah. Here's something you'll recognize, maybe. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The second one you'll recognize from the Declaration of Independence. The first comes from Thomas Jefferson's rough draft of that document. The second was edited in by Ben Franklin. Let's read that first one again now that you know what it was. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. Franklin changed that to self-evident. That all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation they derive rights inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. I want to look at two major changes that Ben Franklin made. First, the change from sacred and undeniable to self-evident. The second, from the preservation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to simply life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness without the preservation bit. In instances like this, I always think it's interesting to start with what the words mean, so we'll look at that first. Sacred, according to the dictionary, means dedicated or set apart for the service of worship or a deity, though perhaps the more appropriate definition for Jefferson's use is worthy of religious veneration or entitled to reverence or respect. The word derives from Latin or Old French. To make holy dates back to the late 14th century. Undeniable means plainly true, incontestable, unquestionably excellent, or genuine. Meanwhile, self-evident means, and in fact this is a newer word for the Founding Fathers, and it's attributed to John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, published in the 1680s, so it was less than 100 years old. It means evident without proof or reasoning. Since I don't like using part of the word in the definition, let's also look at evident, which is defined as clear to the vision or understanding. Evident is older than Locke's self-evident by some 300 years. It comes from the Latin for perceptible, clear, obvious, or apparent. To Jefferson, that all men were created equal with certain unalienable rights is sacred and undeniable, that is, entitled to reverence and respect and unquestionably excellent. To Franklin, it's just obvious. Jefferson, who was in his early 30s at the time, felt the need to put a value judgment. Franklin, some 4 decades older, was kind of past the bullshit and just wanted to see the U.S. out from under a king. It's as simple as that. In his excellent biography of Franklin, Walter Isaacson notes that Franklin's use of self-evident came less from Locke and maybe more from the idea of scientific determinism, the same cause and effect argument we talked about with free will during the empathy series. Isaacson's reading does put a religious tilt on sacred that I chose to work around. He writes this: the idea of self-evident truths was one that drew less on John Locke, who is Jefferson's favorite philosopher, than on the scientific determinism espoused by Isaac Newton and on the analytic empiricism of Franklin's close friend David Hume. What became known as Hume's fork, the great Scottish philosopher, along with Leibniz and others, had developed a theory that distinguished between synthetic truths that describe matters of fact, such as London is bigger than Philadelphia, and analytic truths which are self-evident by virtue of reason and definition. The angles of a triangle equal 180 degrees, all bachelors are unmarried, etc. By using the word sacred, Jefferson had asserted, intentionally or not, that the principle in question, the equality of men and their endowment by their creator with inalienable rights, was an assertion of religion, Franklin's edit turned it instead into an assertion of rationality. The Washington Post takes a little more flippant view of Franklin's edit. Jefferson showed the draft to John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, they write, who suggested self-evident instead, perhaps a polite way to say to the British Crown, as any fool who can plainly see. I'd like to think it was something like Isaacson's idea, a step away from language that felt like faith. Early settlers did leave England, after all, for religious freedom and more into science, which is a particular hobby of Franklin. But Franklin might also have been America's first troll. He would write an opinion piece in his own newspaper, send a letter refuting it under a pseudonym to another paper, then print another pseudonymous letter in his own paper supporting the view. He'd also print columns in his own paper under pseudonyms refuting columns in rival papers. Part of me wants to give Franklin the benefit of the doubt on taking the high road. Given the opportunity, I would certainly name Franklin to my personal board of directors, but I think it's equally as likely that he was slipping the bird of the monarchy. And of course, that wouldn't make me think less of him, because, I'm me. The other change in that opening sentence is also interesting to me. Among the rights that all men had, wrote Jefferson, was the preservation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Franklin dropped the preservation, writing that men had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Preserve derives from keep safe. Preservation, on the other hand, comes from protection from disease. That's an interesting distinction, that preservation specifically has an element of disease in its history. The dictionary tells us that preservation is the activity or process of keeping something valued alive, intact, or free from damage or decay. That also sounds like disease, does it not? Well, this, I think, is a good elimination on Franklin's part. If life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were in danger of decay from some disease in Jefferson's version, in Franklin's, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are inalienable rights to be reclaimed, not healed. As we come up on Independence Day here in the U.S., remember that we were born of an anti-establishment aesthetic. Jefferson was a young upstart assigned with the task of writing a "fuck you, we're out" letter to the king. Franklin, the elder statesman, used his more practiced craft to stick the knife in a little deeper. Keep those attitudes. We need them for those times when complacency rolls into our lives. Now, as we do here in the podcast, we've done this before, but I feel like a lot of us don't know our history here in the U.S., so I want to read the Declaration of Independence. And I'll have a link in the show notes over at betterhumanhood.com to Jefferson's rough draft as well. But here is the fuck you we sent to the crown. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having a direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden the governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation until his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has called together legislative... I apologize. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative body at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices, and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murder for which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us, in many cases, of the benefit of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures, declaring themselves invested with the power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrection among us, has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince, whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be a ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. We have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow those usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representative of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. For the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Signed from New Hampshire, Josiah Bartlett, William Whipple, Matthew Thornton. From Massachusetts, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, John Adams, Robert Treat Payne, Elbridge Gerry. From Rhode Island, Stephen Hopkins, William Ellery. From Connecticut, Roger Sherman, Samuel Huntington, William Williams, Oliver Wolcott. From New York, William Floyd, Philip Livingston, Francis Lewis, and Lewis Morris. From New Jersey, Richard Stockton, John Witherspoon, Francis Hopkinson, John Hart, and Abraham Clark. From Pennsylvania, Robert Morris, Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Franklin, John Morton, George Clymer, James Smith, George Taylor, James Wilson, and George Ross. From Delaware, Caesar Rodney, George Reed, Thomas McKean. From Maryland, Samuel Chase, William Paca, Thomas Stone, Charles Carroll of Carrollton. From Virginia, George Wythe, Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Harrison, Thomas Nelson Jr., Francis Lightfoot Lee, and Carter Braxton. From North Carolina, William Hooper, Joseph Hughes, John Penn. From South Carolina, Edward Rutledge, Thomas Hayward Jr., Thomas Lynch Jr., and Arthur Middleton. And from Georgia, Button Gwinnett, Lyman Hall, and George Walton. So when you are faced with any kind of tyranny from outside of you, remember that at one time, the people we hold great in our country once had to send a big fuck you to the King of England. Figure out who you gotta flip the bird to, and declare yourself free. Be who you are. Be who you will to be. We will see you next time.
Thank you for listening. Get show notes and more at betterhumanhood.com. Leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And have yourself a wonderful day.